Hey there! Tonight we're stepping into one of the most misunderstood aspects of medieval life, the world of love and romance. Modern popular culture has given us elaborate fantasies of knights wooing ladies, of courtly love and chivalric devotion, of love conquering all obstacles. But the reality of how medieval people actually fell in love, courted each other, and formed partnerships was far more complex, more interesting, and often more poignant than the fairy tales suggest. So before settling in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if this kind of deep historical exploration genuinely interests you. And drop a comment about where you're watching from and what time it is there. It's always fascinating to see the community gathered from all corners of the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that gentle background hum, and let's step together into the medieval world of love, where passion and practicality intertwined, where hearts yearned despite constraints, and where the human capacity for affection found expression in ways both familiar and startlingly different from modern romance. When thinking about medieval love, the mind might immediately conjure images from romantic literature. Troubadours singing beneath balconies, knights dedicating tournaments to fair ladies, passionate love affairs defying social conventions. These images, drawn from medieval romance literature and later romanticized retellings, contain elements of historical truth but also considerable fantasy. The actual experience of falling in love in medieval times was shaped by social structures, economic realities, religious teachings, and cultural expectations that made the path to romantic partnership very different from modern courtship. Love in the Middle Ages existed in fascinating tension between competing forces. On one side stood the practical realities of life, the need for economic security, family alliances, social stability, and survival in a precarious world. On the other side stood the universal human capacity for emotional attachment, physical attraction, and romantic yearning that no amount of social control could entirely suppress. Medieval people navigated between these forces, finding ways to express affection within the constraints of their society, sometimes following prescribed paths, and sometimes finding creative detours. The concept of romantic love itself was understood differently in medieval times. The idea that passionate love should be the basis for marriage was actually quite radical and often viewed with suspicion. Marriage was fundamentally an economic and social arrangement, designed to cement alliances, transfer property, and produce legitimate heirs. Love might develop within marriage, and that was considered fortunate, but it wasn't the primary purpose or expectation. Yet this doesn't mean medieval people didn't fall in love. They absolutely did. The historical record is filled with evidence of passionate attachments, devoted partnerships, heartbreak over lost loves, and creative efforts to be with chosen partners despite obstacles. What differed was not the capacity for love, but the social frameworks within which that love could be expressed, and the expectations about love's role in determining life partnerships. The Church, wielding enormous influence over medieval society, had complex and sometimes contradictory teachings about love. On one hand, Christian theology celebrated certain forms of love: spiritual love for the divine, charitable love for neighbours, the sacred bond of marriage. On the other hand, the Church was deeply suspicious of passionate romantic and physical desire, viewing it as potentially leading to wrongdoing and distraction from spiritual matters. The literary tradition of courtly love, which flourished in medieval courts, created idealized models of romantic devotion that influenced how educated people thought about and expressed romantic feelings. These literary conventions, with their elaborate rituals of service, devotion, and restrained passion, existed in interesting relationship with actual romantic practice, sometimes influencing real behavior, and sometimes remaining purely fictional ideals. Social class profoundly affected how people experienced love and courtship. The romantic lives of nobility, documented in letters, literature, and legal records, operated under different rules and possibilities than the romantic lives of peasants and merchants. Yet across all social levels, the fundamental human experiences of attraction, affection, longing, and heartbreak were remarkably consistent, even when expressed in different ways and contexts. The role of family and community in romantic relationships was far more pronounced than in modern, individualistic societies. Romantic partnerships weren't just matters between two individuals, but involved extended families, social networks, and community interests. This collective investment in romantic outcomes created both constraints and supports that shaped how love developed and was expressed. Gender roles and expectations created significantly different experiences of love for men and women. Women's romantic choices were more constrained, their sexual reputation more vulnerable, their economic dependence on marriage more acute. Yet within these constraints, women found agency, expressed preferences, and influenced outcomes in ways that challenged simplistic narratives of medieval women as passive victims of arranged marriages. The physical and emotional expressions of love, from stolen glances to love tokens to physical intimacy, followed patterns both familiar and foreign to modern sensibilities. Medieval people developed their own languages of love, ways of signalling affection and interest that made sense within their cultural context, creating romantic moments that, while perhaps looking different from contemporary courtship, carried the same emotional weight and significance. The consequences of romantic choices, whether following approved paths or transgressing social boundaries, could be severe. Love matches that violated class boundaries, religious restrictions, or family interests faced substantial obstacles. Yet the historical record shows that some couples persevered against these obstacles, demonstrating that the power of romantic attachment could sometimes overcome even formidable social barriers. The stages of life brought different romantic experiences and possibilities. Young people experiencing first love faced different circumstances than widows and widowers seeking companionship in later life. The romantic awakening of adolescence, the establishment of long-term partnerships in young adulthood, the evolution of marriage over decades, the potential for new love after loss, all these represented distinct phases of romantic experience that unfolded across the medieval lifespan. Regional variations created diverse romantic cultures across medieval Europe. Courtship in Mediterranean regions differed from courtship in Scandinavia. The practices of Eastern Europe had distinct character from those of the British Isles. Urban romance in growing cities looked different from rural romance in agricultural villages. This geographic diversity meant that medieval romance was not one uniform experience, but rather a tapestry of related but distinct romantic cultures. The material culture of medieval romance, the physical objects through which love was expressed and remembered, provides tangible evidence of how people thought about and practiced romance. Love tokens, betrothal rings, illuminated manuscripts with romantic scenes, portraits exchanged between lovers, locks of hair carefully preserved, all these material remnants speak to the importance medieval people placed on romantic relationships and the desire to commemorate and celebrate them. Tonight we'll explore this complex landscape of medieval love in comprehensive detail, examining not just the broad patterns, but the nuanced realities of how actual medieval people experienced romance. From arranged marriages that sometimes blossomed into genuine affection, to passionate love affairs that defied convention, from the romantic ideals of courtly literature to the practical realities of peasant courtship, from the church's teachings about love to the actual practices of people navigating between sacred and secular expectations, from young love's first awakenings to the companionship of elderly couples who had spent lifetimes together. This is a story not of one medieval experience of love, but of many, as diverse as the people who lived through these centuries, yet united by the eternal human search for connection, affection, and partnership. This is how people fell in love in the Middle Ages, a tale of constraint and creativity, of practical arrangements and passionate feelings, of social control and human resilience, of hearts that yearned then as they do now, finding ways to connect despite all the obstacles that medieval society placed in love's path. The foundation of medieval romantic life for most people, particularly those of noble or substantial merchant status, was the arranged marriage. This institution, so foreign to modern sensibilities that value romantic love as the basis for marriage, was the normal, expected, and legally endorsed way that most medieval partnerships were formed. Yet the reality of arranged marriage was more nuanced than simple tales of forced unions between unwilling partners suggest. Arranged marriages served multiple purposes in medieval society. They cemented political alliances between noble families, resolved disputes over land and resources, moved wealth between generations, created trade partnerships between merchant families, and ensured that family property remained consolidated rather than dispersed. These practical functions made arranged marriage not just acceptable, but essential to maintaining social stability and economic order. The process of arranging a marriage typically began not with the prospective couple but with their families. Parents, guardians, or family heads would identify suitable matches based on social status, economic resources, family reputation, and strategic interests. For nobility, royal approval might be required. For merchants, business considerations dominated. Even among peasants, family interests in land holdings and labour arrangements influenced partner selection. Negotiations could be lengthy and complex. The terms of a marriage contract, including dowry amounts, property transfers, inheritance rights, and various contingencies, required careful discussion and often involved legal counsel. These negotiations could take months or even years, with multiple families potentially considered before a final match was agreed upon. The couple themselves might not meet until after the contract was finalised, or might meet only briefly in carefully supervised circumstances designed to allow assessment, but not genuine acquaintance. The marriage contract itself was a detailed legal document that specified far more than simply who would marry whom. It outlined precisely what property each party brought to the marriage, what happened to that property during the marriage, and crucially, what would happen to property if the marriage ended through death or, in rare cases, annulment. The contract might specify where the couple would live, what portion of the husband's income the wife would control, what provisions would be made for any children, and countless other details that families wanted legally established before the union proceeded. The dowry system, central to most medieval marriages, represented a substantial transfer of wealth from the bride's family to the couple or the groom's family. The size of the dowry was a major negotiating point, and often the determining factor in whether a match proceeded. Families of daughters needed to accumulate substantial dowries to secure good marriages, which could require years of saving and strategic financial planning. The inability to provide adequate dowry could leave daughters unmarried or force them to accept matches below their social station. The age at which marriages were arranged varied considerably by social class and region. Among nobility, betrothals could be arranged when children were very young, sometimes in infancy, though the actual marriage ceremony and consummation would wait until the individuals reached appropriate age. These childhood betrothals were particularly common when major political alliances were at stake, with families wanting to secure the match before circumstances changed. The betrothed children would grow up knowing their future spouse's identity, though they might have limited contact before the actual marriage. Canon law set minimum ages for valid marriage, typically around 12 for girls and 14 for boys, though regional variation existed and these minimums were sometimes violated. The Church's position was that marriage required sufficient maturity to understand the commitment being made and to consent meaningfully. However, the practical application of this principle was inconsistent, with political and economic pressures sometimes leading to marriages of children younger than the canonical minimum, particularly among high nobility where stakes were highest. For peasants and artisans, marriages typically occurred later, often in the early to mid-20s, when individuals had acquired the skills and resources necessary to establish independent households. This later marriage age meant that peasant couples had more maturity when entering marriage, and sometimes more input into partner selection than their noble counterparts who married younger. The economic requirements of establishing a household, acquiring land or craft tools, building up resources to support a family, all these created natural delays that pushed peasant marriage age higher. The degree of choice allowed to the prospective couple varied tremendously. In the strictest arranged marriages, particularly among high nobility where political stakes were highest, the couple might have essentially no choice and minimal input. They were expected to accept the match their families arranged and make the best of it. Resistance could be futile and might result in serious family conflict or economic consequences. Children who refused appropriate matches might be disinherited, confined, or subjected to intense pressure until they capitulated. However, not all arranged marriages were completely involuntary. Many families allowed children some degree of veto power, the ability to refuse a particularly objectionable match, even if they couldn't actively choose their preferred partner. Some parents sought to arrange matches with partners they believed their children might actually like, trying to balance family interest with their children's potential happiness. This was particularly true in families where parents genuinely cared about their children's well-being, and where the strategic stakes of the marriage weren't overwhelmingly high. The Church's position on marriage consent was theoretically important but practically complex. canon law held that a valid marriage required the free consent of both parties, that marriage could not be forced against someone's will. This principle was genuinely revolutionary for its time, asserting that even a serf had the right to refuse a marriage they didn't want. The church courts would theoretically invalidate marriages where genuine consent hadn't been given. However, the gap between legal theory and social reality was often vast. Pressure to consent could be intense and took many forms. Families could make it clear that refusing an arranged marriage would result in disinheritance, social disgrace, or permanent estrangement. Parents might use emotional manipulation, alternating between pleading and threats, creating situations where children felt they had no real choice. For women especially, refusing a suitable match might mean remaining unmarried with limited economic prospects and permanent dependence on family charity. This coercive context meant that consent could be given under duress, making it questionable whether such consent was truly free in the way canon law theoretically required. Some arranged marriages did develop into genuine love matches. The medieval understanding that love could grow after marriage rather than having to precede it had some practical wisdom. Couples who approached their arranged marriages with good faith effort to build partnership sometimes discovered affection growing between them over months and years. Shared experiences, mutual respect, the intimacy of daily life, and often children created bonds that could become deep and lasting. Some couples who initially resented their arranged matches came to genuinely love each other, their marriages transforming from duty to affection. The stories of successful arranged marriages that became love matches appear in historical records. Letters between married couples show genuine affection and concern, spouses expressing worry during separations and joy at reunions. Widows and widowers who mourned deeply for deceased spouses demonstrated that real love had existed, that the arranged marriage had become something more than mere practical partnership. Some couples overcame initial reluctance about their arranged matches to build partnerships that sustained them through decades, becoming models of successful marriage that their communities celebrated. Conversely, many arranged marriages remained essentially business partnerships without deep emotional connection. The couple might coexist civilly, fulfill their social and reproductive duties, and maintain public appearances while having little genuine affection for each other. They would manage their household efficiently, raise their children competently, and present a united front to the world, but privately maintain emotional distance. These marriages weren't necessarily unhappy in the sense of active misery, but they lacked the warmth and intimacy that makes marriage a source of emotional fulfillment, rather than just a social and economic arrangement. Some arranged marriages were actively unhappy, with couples trapped in partnerships they found unsatisfying, or even miserable, unable to escape due to religious prohibitions on divorce and social pressures to maintain the union. These unhappy marriages could take many forms. Couples who simply disliked each other's personalities, marriages where one partner had hoped for love but the other remained indifferent, situations where personality conflicts created constant friction, or cases where one partner's behaviour, whether through cruelty, neglect or other failings, made the marriage genuinely oppressive for the other. The double standard regarding arranged marriages was stark. Men in unhappy arranged marriages had more options for seeking satisfaction elsewhere. Extramarital relationships, while technically forbidden by church teaching, were often tolerated for men if conducted discreetly and didn't create public scandal. Men also had more ability to leave unhappy situations physically, even if they couldn't leave legally, travelling for business or war, maintaining separate residences, engaging in activities independent of their wives. They could find fulfillment through work, politics, military service, or other pursuits that took them away from unsatisfying domestic situations. Women in unhappy arranged marriages had far fewer options. They were trapped by economic dependence, since few women could support themselves independently. They were constrained by social expectations that required wives to remain with their husbands and maintain household duties regardless of personal unhappiness. They faced very real danger to their reputations if they sought comfort outside marriage, with women's extramarital relationships judged far more harshly than men's. The combination of economic, social and moral constraints made escape from unhappy arranged marriage nearly impossible for most medieval women. Children from arranged marriages often witnessed their parents' relationships and drew conclusions about what marriage meant. Those who saw parents who genuinely cared for each other, who showed affection and partnership, learned that arranged marriages could work, that duty and love need not be opposed, that commitment chosen by families could nonetheless produce genuine emotional bonds. These children might approach their own eventual arranged marriages with optimism, believing that they too could find happiness within the system. Those who saw unhappy parents learned very different lessons. They witnessed marriages characterized by coldness, conflict, or simple coexistence without warmth. They learned that marriage was duty and endurance rather than love and fulfillment, that romantic feelings were separate from marital obligations, that one couldn't expect emotional satisfaction from an arranged match. These childhood observations shaped expectations that individuals brought to their own eventual marriages, creating self-fulfilling prophecies where people who expected arranged marriage to be unhappy often found it so. The negotiation of power within arranged marriages was ongoing throughout the relationship. A couple who barely knew each other before marriage had to work out how they would function as a partnership. Who made decisions about household management? Who controlled money and property? How were disagreements resolved? What level of intimacy and affection would they share? These questions required continuous negotiation, with outcomes depending on individual personalities, relative economic power brought to the marriage, family support each spouse could claim, and countless other factors unique to each couple. Some women wielded considerable power within arranged marriages despite the formal patriarchal structure of medieval society. Strong personalities who refused to be dominated could carve out authority within their marriages. Women who brought substantial dowries and maintained control over their property had economic leverage their husbands couldn't entirely ignore. Women from powerful families could call on familial support if husbands mistreated them. Women who proved competent at household management earned respect that translated into influence over decisions. The formal inequality of medieval marriage didn't always translate to practical powerlessness for all women. The possibility of annulment provided a potential escape from intolerable arranged marriages, though this was difficult, expensive, and rarely successful. Grounds for annulment included non-consummation, discovery of prior contracts that invalidated the current marriage, blood relationship within prohibited degrees that should have prevented the marriage, and coercion that vitiated consent. Proving these grounds required evidence, witnesses, and often substantial payments to church courts. The process could take years and offered no guarantee of success. For most people in unhappy arranged marriages, annulment was theoretically possible, but practically unattainable. The costs were prohibitive for any but the wealthy. The evidence required was often impossible to produce. The social stigma of seeking annulment could be severe, and even if annulment was granted, the consequences could be harsh, particularly for women who might lose property rights and face greatly diminished prospects for remarriage. The very difficulty of annulment meant that most people in unsatisfying marriages had no choice but to continue, making the best of situations they couldn't change. The emotional toll of arranged marriages, particularly unhappy ones, appeared in various ways in medieval culture. Literature featured many stories of unhappy arranged marriages, suggesting this was a recognized social problem that resonated with audiences. Tales of wives trapped with cruel or indifferent husbands, of husbands burdened with unwanted wives, of young people forced into unions they dreaded. All these stories appeared repeatedly in medieval literature, indicating that fictional portrayals of marriage unhappiness reflected real experiences. Religious writings counselled patience and duty for those trapped in unsatisfying marriages. The Church taught that marriage was a sacrament that couldn't be undone, and that spouses had obligations to each other regardless of personal feelings. Enduring an unhappy marriage with good grace was presented as virtuous suffering that would be rewarded in the afterlife. This religious framing provided some comfort to those trapped in unsatisfying situations, offering meaning for their suffering even if it didn't provide escape. Legal records show occasional desperate attempts to escape arranged marriages through annulment claims or even abandonment. Some individuals simply fled their marriages, leaving spouses and starting new lives elsewhere, though this brought its own severe consequences. The historical record contains cases of people who went to extraordinary lengths to escape intolerable marriages, demonstrating that for some, the arranged marriage system created genuinely unbearable situations that drove desperate measures. Yet arranged marriage remained the dominant system throughout the medieval period because it served social functions that individuals' romantic preferences did not. Society needed stable property transmission to prevent families from losing their wealth and status across generations. Clear inheritance lines had to be maintained to avoid disputes and chaos. Economic alliances between families created networks of mutual support that helped all parties weather difficulties. Political stability often rested on marriages that cemented peace between formerly warring factions. Allowing young people to marry based purely on romantic attraction threatened all these structural needs in ways that made arranged marriage seem necessary despite its costs to individual happiness. The medieval understanding that marriage was fundamentally about social and economic function, rather than romantic fulfillment, created different expectations than modern marriage carries. Medieval people didn't necessarily expect marriage to make them happy in the romantic sense. They expected it to provide economic security, appropriate social status, legitimate children, and a functioning household. If love developed, that was wonderful, a blessing beyond what was strictly required. If not, the marriage could still be considered successful if it fulfilled these practical functions. Personal happiness was secondary to social and economic considerations in determining whether a marriage was working as it should. This doesn't mean medieval people didn't desire love or didn't suffer when trapped in loveless marriages. The human heart wants what it wants, across all historical periods. Letters, diaries, and literary sources make clear that medieval people yearned for affection, suffered from loneliness within cold marriages, and sometimes grieved privately for romantic possibilities foreclosed by arranged matches. But medieval society had structured marriage in ways that prioritized functions other than romantic fulfillment, requiring individuals to navigate between their emotional desires and social expectations in ways that often created tension and sometimes genuine suffering. The legacy of arranged marriage extended well beyond the medieval period, continuing in various forms for centuries and persisting in some cultures today. The gradual shift toward marriages based on mutual affection and individual choice was slow and uneven, with arranged marriage remaining normal in some social classes and regions long after it had become unusual in others. The medieval experience of arranged marriage, with all its complexity and variation, was a crucial chapter in the longer history of how human societies have structured romantic partnerships. For the medieval person entering an arranged marriage, the experience combined resignation, hope, anxiety, and pragmatic determination. They were participating in a social institution that might bring happiness or unhappiness, that might produce genuine love or merely functional partnership, that would define much of their adult life regardless of their personal preferences. Some approached this with optimism, believing they could make a good match work and trusting their parents' judgment about suitable partners. Some approached it with dread, knowing they were entering a union they didn't want. Most probably felt a mix of both emotions, accepting that this was simply how life proceeded. That romantic preference was less important than family duty, and that somehow they would make the best of whatever partnership their families had arranged. The wedding ceremony itself in arranged marriages carried particular emotional weight. This was the moment when theoretical arrangements became lived reality, when two relative strangers became legally bound to each other for life. The ceremony followed prescribed rituals that varied by region and social class, but certain elements were nearly universal: the exchange of vows, the blessing by clergy, the witnessing by family and community. These public rituals transformed private negotiations into social facts, creating marriages that everyone present was expected to acknowledge and support. For the couple, particularly if they had met only briefly before the wedding, the ceremony could be surreal. Speaking vows to someone they barely knew, promising lifetime commitment to a near stranger, required a kind of faith that modern romantic sensibilities find difficult to comprehend. Yet medieval people approached this with the understanding that commitment preceded affection, that the vows created a framework within which love might eventually develop. They were making a leap of faith that their families had chosen well, that duty would evolve into affection, that what began as arrangement might become genuine partnership. The wedding night held particular significance in arranged marriages. This was often when the couple would truly be alone together for the first time, when the physical dimension of their relationship would begin. The expectations and anxieties surrounding this first intimate encounter were substantial. Couples were supposed to consummate the marriage, both to fulfill religious expectations about proper marriage and to make the union legally complete and binding. Yet they were often doing so with minimal privacy, as witnesses might wait outside the chamber to verify that consummation had occurred, and with little prior knowledge of each other's bodies, desires, or preferences. The adjustment period following an arranged marriage could be challenging. Couples had to learn each other's habits, preferences, temperaments, and expectations, while simultaneously managing a household, fulfilling social obligations, and potentially dealing with pregnancy and childbirth. Some couples navigated this successfully, developing effective partnerships quickly through good communication and mutual goodwill. Others struggled for months or years to find equilibrium, working through conflicts and misunderstandings before achieving comfortable partnership. Still others never achieved comfortable partnership, maintaining functional but unsatisfying relationships throughout their lives. The birth of children often transformed arranged marriages significantly. Shared parenthood created new bonds and common purposes that hadn't existed in the marriage before. A husband who had been indifferent to his wife might become devoted to their children, and, through that devotion, develop new appreciation for their mother and the partnership that produced them. A wife who had resented her arranged marriage might find fulfillment in motherhood that compensated for romantic disappointments with her husband. The focus on children could redirect energy from marital dissatisfaction to family building, creating shared purpose even where romantic love hadn't developed. However, difficulties with conception or childbirth could also strain arranged marriages. If a couple failed to produce children, particularly male heirs who could inherit property and titles, pressure from extended family could be intense. The wife would typically be blamed, regardless of where the actual problem lay, since medieval medical understanding couldn't identify male infertility. This could create resentment, anxiety, and deterioration of whatever affection had developed. Some marriages were annulled due to inability to produce heirs, with the woman typically suffering more severe social and economic consequences than the man. The aging process within arranged marriages created its own dynamics. Couples who had lived together for decades developed deep knowledge of each other, even if romantic love had never blossomed. Shared history, whether joyful or difficult, created bonds of a kind. Elderly couples in long-arranged marriages often showed genuine partnership and mutual care, having built relationships that, while perhaps not romantic in conventional sense, were nonetheless meaningful and sustaining. They had weathered life's challenges together, raised children, managed households, and created lives that were deeply intertwined even if they'd never experienced passionate romance. The death of one spouse in an arranged marriage could provoke complex grief. Surviving partners might mourn not just the deceased, but also the relationship they never had, the love that never developed, the possibilities that the marriage never fulfilled. There could be guilt mixed with grief, wondering if they could have tried harder to build affection, regret for opportunities missed to create a better partnership. Alternatively, they might genuinely grieve a partner who had become, through years of shared life, a true companion even if initial union was unwanted. The emotional experience of widowhood from arranged marriage was as varied as the marriages themselves. Parallel to the practical world of arranged marriages existed a fascinating literary and cultural phenomenon that shaped how educated medieval people thought about romantic love, the tradition of courtly love. This elaborate system of romantic ideals expressed in poetry, song, and story created models of passionate devotion that existed in provocative tension with the arranged marriages that actually structured most people's lives. Courtly love emerged in the courts of southern France during the 12th century, particularly in the regions of Provence and Aquitaine, spreading throughout Western Europe and influencing romantic culture for centuries afterward. The tradition was expressed primarily through poetry and song, with troubadours composing elaborate verses celebrating idealized romantic relationships that followed specific conventions and rules. These poets, both professional entertainers dependent on noble patronage and amateur nobles composing for their own pleasure, created a body of literature that fundamentally shaped how educated Europeans thought about romantic love. The typical courtly love relationship, at least as portrayed in literature, involved a knight or nobleman devoted to a lady of higher social status, often the wife of his lord. This devotion was expressed through service, performing deeds of valour in her honour, composing poetry celebrating her perfections, and engaging in elaborate protestations of undying love. The relationship was supposed to remain unconsummated, with the knight's love remaining pure and spiritual rather than physical. though the tension between this ideal and human desire created much of the drama in courtly love literature. The lady in courtly love literature was portrayed as perfect, beautiful beyond measure, virtuous beyond reproach, and elevated above the mundane world. She was an almost divine figure whose favour was the ultimate reward a knight could seek, and whose disdain was crushing rejection worse than any physical defeat. The knight's love for her was supposed to ennoble him, making him braver in battle, more virtuous in conduct, and more accomplished in every endeavour. Her approval or disapproval of his deeds provided the motivation for his actions, with pleasing her being more important than wealth, glory, or even life itself. The structure of courtly love followed predictable stages or steps that the lover progressed through. First came the sight of the lady that inspired immediate and overwhelming love. This love at first sight was portrayed as beyond the lover's control, an irresistible force that captured him completely. Then came the knight's initial hesitation and suffering in silence, as he struggled with whether to declare his feelings and risk rejection. Next came the declaration of love, typically indirect and deferential, acknowledging the lady's superiority and his unworthiness. This was followed by the lady's testing of the knight's devotion through various challenges and trials designed to prove his sincerity and commitment. Finally came the lady's gradual acceptance of the knight's service, and some acknowledgement of his devotion, though full physical consummation was theoretically forever forbidden. The language of courtly love was elaborate and coded. Lovers in troubadour poetry didn't speak directly, but used metaphors, symbols, and conventional phrases that initiated audiences would understand while maintaining some level of discretion. The lady might be referred to as my heart, or my life, or given a sinhal, a code name that protected her identity while still allowing the poet to celebrate her publicly. This coded language allowed risky or socially transgressive emotions to be expressed relatively safely, since the poet could always claim the poetry was purely fictional, or that the senhal referred to someone other than who listeners suspected. The question of whether courtly love represented actual practice, or was purely literary fantasy, has long puzzled historians, and continues to generate scholarly debate. Some argue that courtly love poetry described real romantic relationships, albeit in highly idealized form, and that the conventions of courtly love literature influenced actual behaviour among the nobility who consumed this literature. Others contend that it was entirely fictional, a literary game with no connection to actual romantic behaviour, meant purely as entertainment without expecting anyone to actually live according to these ideals. The truth likely lies somewhere between these extremes, with literary conventions both reflecting and shaping actual romantic practices in complex ways. Evidence suggests that courtly love conventions did influence real romantic relationships, at least among the educated nobility who were exposed to this literature. Love letters surviving from the medieval period sometimes employ courtly love language and conventions, suggesting that people used these literary models to express and understand their own romantic feelings. When a nobleman wrote to a lady using elaborate metaphors and protestations of unworthiness drawn from courtly love literature, he was drawing on a shared cultural vocabulary that both parties understood, using these conventions to communicate genuine feelings, even if the specific language was formulaic. Young nobles raised on courtly love romances, having heard troubadour performances and read romantic literature as part of their education, might have attempted to model their actual romantic behaviour on these literary examples. A knight who dedicated his tournament performance to a specific lady, who wore her colours, who sought her favour, was enacting patterns drawn directly from courtly love literature. Whether his feelings were as pure and spiritual as courtly love ideals suggested is another question, but the outward behaviour was clearly influenced by literary conventions. However, the practical application of courtly love ideals created obvious problems. The convention that courtly love should be adulterous, directed towards someone else's wife rather than an unmarried woman or one's own wife, contradicted Christian teachings about marriage and fidelity. The Church firmly condemned adultery, making the celebration of extramarital love problematic from a religious standpoint. The idealization of women in courtly love literature, elevating them to positions of power and authority over their knightly lovers, conflicted with the actual subordinate position of women in medieval society, where wives were legally subject to their husband's authority. The emphasis on unconsummated passion, love that remained forever unfulfilled physically, contradicted both human nature and the social imperative to produce heirs to inherit property and continue family lines. These contradictions meant that courtly love existed in perpetual tension with social reality, celebrated in literature but difficult or impossible to practice literally in actual life. Some scholars interpret courtly love as a kind of rebellion against arranged marriage, a way for people trapped in loveless marriages to explore romantic passion, even if only in literature and imagination. In a society where most noble marriages were arranged for political and economic reasons, courtly love literature offered an alternative vision of romantic relationships based on choice, merit, and freely given devotion. The emphasis on the lover choosing his beloved for her virtues, rather than having a spouse assigned by family interests, represented desires that arranged marriage couldn't fulfill. Courtly love literature might have provided vicarious satisfaction for people whose actual romantic lives were constrained by social obligations, allowing them to experience in imagination the passionate romantic choices denied them in reality. The role of women in courtly love was complex and contradictory. On one hand, courtly love elevated women to positions of power and authority highly unusual in medieval society. The lady whose favour the knight sought wielded genuine power in these literary relationships, able to command his service, impose tests and trials, accept or reject his devotion at her will. She was portrayed as superior to the knight in ways that reversed normal gender hierarchies, where women were legally and socially subordinate to men. This literary elevation of women could be seen as progressive, offering alternative visions of gender relations that challenged patriarchal norms. On the other hand, this power was purely literary and did nothing to improve women's actual social and legal positions. The lady in courtly love literature might command knights and exercise power, but real medieval women still couldn't own property independently in most regions, couldn't hold political office, were subject to their husband's or father's authority, and had limited legal rights. The idealization of women in literature coexisted with continued oppression of women in reality, perhaps even serving to contain challenges to male authority by redirecting them into purely fictional realms, where they posed no real threat to existing power structures. Some female poets, the Troubadourists of southern France, wrote their own courtly love poetry, expressing women's perspectives on romantic relationships. Their poetry sometimes challenged or complicated the male-authored courtly love tradition, showing women's desires and concerns that male poets had glossed over or ignored. These female voices demonstrated that women were not just passive objects of male devotion, but active participants in romantic culture with their own perspectives, desires, and criticisms. The Troubadourists wrote about longing for absent lovers, frustration with unfaithful partners, and the challenges of maintaining dignity while experiencing romantic passion, offering perspectives that enriched and complicated the courtly love tradition. The Church's response to courtly love was largely critical. Many clergy condemned courtly love literature as promoting adultery, celebrating illicit passion, and distracting people from spiritual concerns that should take priority over earthly romantic attachments. The fact that some of the most famous courtly love romances, like the story of Lancelot and Guinevere in Arthurian legend, involved adultery that ultimately destroyed kingdoms and caused immense suffering, didn't help the tradition's reputation among religious authorities. Yet courtly love persisted despite clerical criticism, suggesting it fulfilled cultural needs that religious opposition couldn't suppress, providing vocabulary and frameworks for romantic feelings that people found valuable despite official disapproval. The practical influence of courtly love on actual courtship behaviour probably varied tremendously by social class and region. Among the highest nobility, living in courts where troubadours regularly performed, and where courtly love literature was read and discussed, the influence was likely significant. These people were constantly exposed to courtly love ideals and might have internalized them as models for their own romantic behaviour. Among peasants with little or no access to literature and living in circumstances where the elaborate conventions of courtly love made no practical sense, courtly love probably had minimal direct impact. The middle ranks of society, prosperous merchants and minor nobility, perhaps fell somewhere between, influenced by courtly love ideals to the extent they could access the literature, and had circumstances that allowed them to indulge in its conventions. The rituals associated with courtly love found real-world expression in aristocratic culture, even if the full ideal remained purely literary. Knights really did dedicate tournament performances to specific ladies, fighting in their honour and seeking their favour. Gifts were exchanged between aristocratic men and women that carried romantic significance: rings, jewels, elaborate tokens. Love poetry was composed and circulated among the educated classes, with noblemen writing verses to ladies and sharing them within court circles. These practices, while perhaps less idealised than literary portrayal suggested, demonstrated that courtly love wasn't entirely fictional, but had real behavioural expressions among the nobility. The concept of finamores, refined or perfected love, that was central to courtly love tradition, emphasised the ennobling quality of proper romantic devotion. Love, pursued in the right way with the right attitudes, was supposed to make the lover a better person, more virtuous, more accomplished, more worthy of respect. A knight who loved properly would become braver, more generous, more courteous, more loyal. His love would inspire him to great deeds and drive him toward moral excellence. This idea that romantic love could be morally improving rather than morally dangerous offered an alternative to the Church's largely negative view of romantic passion as distraction from spiritual concerns and potential source of wrongdoing. The geographical spread of courtly love created regional variations as the tradition adapted to different cultural contexts. The troubadours of southern France, who originated the tradition, emphasised adultery and unconsummated passion more than later traditions in other regions. The Minnesingers of Germany, who adapted courtly love to German-speaking regions, sometimes incorporated Christian elements more explicitly, attempting to reconcile romantic devotion with religious values. The courtly love tradition in England, influenced by both French and German versions, developed its own characteristics, often embedding courtly love themes in longer narrative romances like the Arthurian legends. These regional differences demonstrate that courtly love was a living tradition that evolved and adapted to different contexts rather than a fixed set of unchanging conventions. The performance context of courtly love was crucial to its social function. Troubadour performances weren't private events, but public entertainments that occurred in court settings with complex social dynamics. When a troubadour performed a love poem celebrating a particular lady, this had social and political implications beyond simply expressing romantic feeling. The poetry praised the lady and elevated her status, which reflected well on her husband and family. It demonstrated the court's cultural sophistication and patronage of arts. It created networks of mutual obligation and esteem between the poet and his patrons. These performances served social and political functions beyond simply entertaining, creating and maintaining the intricate web of relationships that sustained aristocratic court culture. The economics of courtly love were significant and shaped how the tradition functioned. Troubadours and minnesingers depended on patronage from wealthy nobles who supported them financially in exchange for performances and poetic works. This economic relationship meant that troubadours had to please their patrons, which influenced the content and tone of their poetry. They praised the families that supported them, celebrated the virtues of their patrons' courts, and promoted values that their aristocratic audiences wanted to hear. The romantic content of courtly love poetry was embedded in larger systems of economic and political relationships that shaped what could be said, and how. The education required to participate fully in courtly love culture was extensive. Understanding the poetry required literacy, which was limited to a small educated elite in medieval society. It required familiarity with literary conventions, knowledge of the complex symbolic systems that poets employed, understanding of classical and religious allusions that filled the poetry. Composing courtly love poetry demanded even more: skill in versification, mastery of complex poetic forms like the troubadour's verse or the German minnelied, musical ability if the poetry was to be sung. This meant that courtly love was primarily an elite cultural form, accessible mainly to educated nobility and those in their circles, while the vast majority of medieval people had no direct contact with this tradition. The relationship between courtly love and actual nobility was reciprocal and reinforcing. Courtly love literature promoted ideals of noble behaviour, courage, generosity, courtesy, loyalty, refined manners that served to justify noble privilege. If nobles were innately more refined and capable of experiencing true love in ways that common people couldn't, then their elevated social position seemed natural and deserved. Courtly love thus functioned partly as aristocratic ideology, promoting values and self-understandings that reinforced class hierarchy and validated the special status of nobility. Yet courtly love could also critique nobility. Some courtly love literature featured noble characters who failed to live up to romantic ideals, knights who were cowardly or discourteous, or false to their loves. These critiques suggested that noble birth alone wasn't sufficient, that true nobility required corresponding virtue and behaviour. Merely having aristocratic blood didn't automatically make someone capable of the refined love that courtly literature celebrated. This created tension between courtly love as reinforcement of aristocracy and courtly love as standard by which aristocracy could be judged and found wanting, with the literature serving both to validate noble privilege and to challenge nobles to live up to higher standards. The legal complications that could arise from courtly love were real and sometimes serious. If a married woman was publicly celebrated in poetry as someone's beloved, her husband might take offence, viewing this as threat to his honour even if the poetry was supposedly purely conventional. If a knight's devotion to another man's wife seemed to cross from literary convention to actual romantic relationship, accusations and conflicts could result. Courts had to navigate between tolerating courtly love as accepted cultural form that everyone understood to be partly fictional and preventing it from creating genuine social disruption through affairs and conflicts that threatened social order. The emotional education provided by courtly love literature was significant for those exposed to it. Young nobles learned from these stories what love was supposed to look and feel like, how lovers should behave toward each other, what emotions and experiences constituted real love as opposed to mere lust or casual attachment. This shaped expectations about romantic relationships and provided vocabulary for understanding and expressing romantic feelings. Even if the specific conventions of courtly love weren't followed literally in actual relationships, they influenced how people conceptualized romantic experience, what they hoped for from romantic partnerships, and how they understood their own feelings. The spiritual dimensions of courtly love drew on religious language and imagery in ways that seemed blasphemous to critics, but meaningful to practitioners. Describing romantic love using terms usually reserved for religious devotion, treating the beloved as object of worship who commanded total dedication, framing romantic suffering as purification similar to religious penance. All these borrowed from Christian tradition, while redirecting devotional energy toward earthly rather than divine objects. This spiritual romantic fusion created a distinctive medieval form of romantic idealism that treated romantic love as something sacred and elevated rather than merely physical or worldly. The decline of courtly love as a dominant literary form during the late medieval period didn't eliminate its influence on how people thought about romance. The conventions established by courtly love continued to shape romantic expectations and behaviours long after troubadours stopped composing verses. The emphasis on individual choice in romantic relationships, on love as worthy of celebration rather than mere practical arrangement, on romantic devotion as potentially ennobling rather than simply dangerous distraction, all these ideas persisted and became part of broader European romantic culture. The specific forms of courtly love poetry became less popular, but the underlying concepts about romantic love that the tradition promoted continued influencing how subsequent generations thought about and practiced romance. While courtly love flourished in aristocratic courts, and arranged marriages structured noble alliances, the romantic lives of medieval peasants, who comprised the vast majority of the population, followed different patterns shaped by different circumstances and constraints. Peasant romance, less documented than noble relationships, but no less real or meaningful to those who experienced it, operated within the realities of agricultural labour, communal living, and economic precarity that created distinctive approaches to courtship and partnership formation. Peasant marriages, while less elaborately arranged than noble ones, were still fundamentally practical partnerships rather than primarily romantic unions. A young peasant choosing a spouse had to consider not just personal attraction or emotional connection, but whether the potential partner would be a capable work companion in the demanding agricultural life they would share. Marriage meant establishing a household that would function as an economic unit, with both partners contributing essential labour to survival. A peasant needed a spouse who could manage the household, work in the fields, tend animals, preserve food, produce clothing, raise children, and perform countless other tasks that keeping a household functioning required. Romantic feelings certainly mattered and influenced peasant marital choices, but they had to be weighed against practical considerations in ways that modern romantic ideals make difficult to understand. A peasant might love someone deeply, but still hesitate to marry them if they seemed unreliable as a work partner. Alternatively, a peasant might marry someone they didn't initially love deeply if they seemed like they would be a good spouse in practical terms, hoping that affection would develop through shared life and labour. The balance between romantic and practical considerations varied by individual, but few peasants could afford to ignore practical assessment of potential partners' capacity for the hard work that peasant life demanded. The process of peasant courtship often began within the agricultural community, where young people grew up together. Unlike nobles who might meet their betrothed only at the wedding after negotiations between families they'd never seen before, peasant youth typically knew potential partners from childhood. They had worked alongside each other in fields during harvest, attended church together every Sunday, participated in village festivals and celebrations, played together as children and laboured together as they matured. This familiarity meant that courtship built on existing knowledge and relationships, rather than starting from complete ignorance of the other person's character and habits. Village festivals and celebrations provided particularly important contexts where young people could interact with some freedom from everyday work constraints and supervision. Harvest festivals celebrated the successful bringing in of crops with feasting, music and dancing. Saints' Day celebrations honoured the village's patron saint with religious services, followed by communal festivities. Seasonal celebrations marked key points in the agricultural year, from spring planting festivals to midsummer bonfires to winter solstice gatherings. All these events created opportunities for dancing, games and socialising that allowed romantic interest to be explored and expressed within acceptable communal contexts. These communal gatherings served important functions in facilitating courtship within the structured routines of agricultural life. During ordinary workdays, interactions between unmarried young people were generally supervised and task-focused, but during festivals some relaxation of supervision occurred, allowing young people to talk, dance, and interact more freely. The communal setting still provided oversight, preventing completely inappropriate behaviour, but within acceptable bounds young people could get to know each other, express interest, and begin forming attachments that might lead to marriage. Parents still influenced peasant marriage choices significantly, though often less absolutely than in noble families. A peasant father might refuse permission for a daughter to marry someone he considered unsuitable, whether because the prospective husband seemed lazy, came from a disreputable family, had inadequate resources, or for other reasons. But if the daughter was determined, she had more options for resistance than a noble daughter would have. She might elope with her chosen partner despite paternal disapproval. She might enlist support from her mother or other family members to pressure her father. She might simply delay and outlast her father's opposition. The economic stakes of peasant marriages, while significant to the families involved, rarely carried the massive political implications that made noble marriages essentially affairs of state, where individual preferences had to be entirely subordinated to family interests. The negotiation of peasant marriages involved discussing practical matters that would determine the new household's viability. What household goods would each partner bring to the marriage? What land rights might they access, either through inheritance or rental arrangements? How would their labour fit into broader family and community work patterns? Would they establish an independent household immediately, or live with one set of parents initially? These negotiations happen between families, but typically with more direct input from the prospective couple than noble negotiations allowed, since peasants had more intimate knowledge of the practical details being discussed, and since the marriage would directly affect their daily working lives in ways that required their understanding and agreement. Bundling, a courtship practice where a courting couple would lie together in bed, fully clothed, often with some physical barrier like a wooden board between them, allowed intimate conversation and some physical proximity while theoretically preserving virginity until marriage. This practice, documented in various European peasant communities, though its prevalence and specific forms varied by region, recognised young people's desire for intimacy and privacy during courtship, while attempting to maintain the premarital chastity that church teachings demanded. The couple could talk privately, away from family supervision, becoming emotionally intimate while the physical barriers and their remaining clothed were supposed to prevent sexual activity. Whether bundling actually prevented premarital relations is highly questionable, and the historical evidence suggests that many couples who practice bundling did engage in sexual activity despite the theoretical safeguards. However, the practice provided a culturally sanctioned context for courtship intimacy that balanced youthful desires against community standards. If pregnancy resulted from bundling, the couple was generally expected to marry quickly, and the community would often overlook the premarital pregnancy if the marriage proceeded promptly. The practice acknowledged practical realities about young people's sexual desires while maintaining at least the appearance of conforming to religious teachings about premarital chastity. The role of community in peasant romance was substantial and shaped courtship in important ways. Small agricultural villages meant limited privacy, with everyone knowing everyone else's business through daily interaction and constant proximity. A courtship between two young people couldn't be kept entirely secret, and community opinion mattered significantly. Young people whose behaviour violated community standards, whether through inappropriate sexual conduct, neglect of work responsibilities in pursuit of romantic interests, or romantic choices that seemed foolish or dangerous, faced gossip, intervention by village elders, and social pressure to conform to expectations. This collective oversight both constrained individual choice and provided important protections. It made some romantic choices difficult or impossible when the community disapproved. But it also provided protection against coercion or exploitation, since relationships conducted in relative public view couldn't easily become abusive without community knowledge and potential intervention. The community's involvement in individual romantic lives while limiting privacy created accountability that offered some safeguards, particularly for women who might otherwise be vulnerable to male coercion. The economic realities of peasant life meant that marriage often couldn't happen until the couple had accumulated sufficient resources to establish a household. This required years of labour, saving, and possibly waiting for inheritance or access to land. Unlike nobles, who might marry as teenagers when families arranged matches, peasants often couldn't afford to marry until their 20s or even early 30s. The delay between when couples might have wanted to marry and when they could afford to do so created tensions between romantic desires and economic possibilities. A young couple in love might have to wait years before they could marry, during which time they had to navigate maintaining their relationship while also fulfilling family work obligations, avoiding behaviours that would damage reputations before marriage, and dealing with the frustration of delayed fulfilment of their desires. Some couples maintained faithful attachments through these waiting periods and eventually married successfully. Others found their relationships couldn't survive the delay, with one or both parties eventually marrying different partners who became available when circumstances aligned better. The forced delay of peasant marriage created its own romantic dramas and challenges distinct from those facing nobles who could marry quickly when families approved matches. Premarital pregnancy among peasants, while officially condemned by the church as a violation of teachings about chastity, was actually quite common in many medieval communities. Many peasant brides were visibly pregnant at their weddings, or gave birth only a few months after marriage, suggesting that either sexual relationships began well before marriage, or that betrothals were considered by couples to legitimize intimacy even before the formal ceremony blessed by the church. Community responses to premarital pregnancy varied, but if the couple married quickly, the situation could often be smoothed over without lasting scandal. The baby would be legitimate since born to married parents, and while everyone would know the child was conceived before marriage, communities often chose to overlook this rather than ostracize young families. The wedding celebrations of peasants differed dramatically from the elaborate ceremonies of nobility. Instead of grand court celebrations with hundreds of guests, fine foods, and entertainment by professional musicians, peasant weddings were village affairs with relatively simple ceremonies, followed by communal feasting and celebration. The ceremony might occur at the church door or inside the parish church, with the local priest performing the blessing. The feast afterward would feature food contributed by various families, home-brewed ale, and music provided by whoever in the village could play instruments or sing. These celebrations, while less grand than noble weddings, were important community events that marked the formation of a new household and the changing social status of the couple, who moved from being unmarried youths to full adult members of the community with households of their own. The consummation of peasant marriages happened with rather more privacy than noble couples often had, since peasant communities generally didn't maintain the elaborate bedding ceremony customs that required witnesses to verify consummation. However, the consummation still occurred within a community context, where neighbours knew what was supposed to be happening on the wedding night and would be curious about whether the marriage had been properly completed. The expectation was that the marriage would be consummated promptly, both to satisfy religious requirements about completing the marriage bond and to begin the process of producing children who would be essential labour for the household economy in future years. The daily reality of peasant marriage was fundamentally shaped by shared labour in ways that noble marriages generally weren't. Husband and wife worked together constantly, managing the household, working fields, caring for animals, preserving food, making clothing, maintaining buildings, and raising children. This constant cooperation created intimacy of a kind through the shared experiences and mutual dependence that daily joint labour produced. Whether this working partnership generated romantic affection depended heavily on individual personalities and the quality of the relationship, but the constant collaboration at least created the possibility for affection to develop through familiarity and shared purpose. Some peasant couples developed genuine partnerships based on mutual respect, affection, and shared commitment to their family's welfare. These couples worked together harmoniously, made decisions cooperatively, showed affection in their interactions, and created households characterized by warmth and mutual support. Others merely coexisted, fulfilling complementary economic functions without much emotional connection, their marriages being primarily practical arrangements that kept households functioning even without deep affection between spouses. Still others had relationships characterized by conflict, with couples whose personalities clashed or whose resentments over various issues created constant friction that made the shared labour of their lives unpleasant, even though they remained married, because the practical and economic bonds of peasant marriage were difficult to break. The hardships of peasant life created particular pressures on marriages that tested couples' bonds in ways that more privileged classes often didn't experience as intensely. Crop failures meant hunger and genuine risk of starvation. Illness struck without warning and often without effective treatment available. Deaths of children were tragically common, with many couples losing multiple children to disease, accident or malnutrition. The Lord's demands for labour services and payments strained household resources. Conflicts with neighbours over land boundaries or other disputes could create stress. All these challenges tested couples' ability to support each other through difficulties. Some marriages grew stronger through shared suffering, with couples supporting each other through tragedies and hardships in ways that deepened their bonds and created profound partnership, forged through surviving terrible experiences together. Couples who had endured crop failures, lost children, weathered illness, and overcome obstacles together often developed deep connections based not on romantic passion, but on tested loyalty and proven mutual support. These relationships, while perhaps not matching romantic ideals, represented genuine partnerships that sustained families through genuinely difficult circumstances. Other marriages frayed under the strain of constant hardship. Stress could create resentment, with spouses blaming each other for failures or misfortunes. Tragedies like losing children could drive wedges between couples rather than bringing them closer, particularly if they grieved differently, or if one blamed the other for the loss. The constant pressure of mere survival could wear away whatever initial affection had existed, leaving couples who remained married out of necessity and lack of alternatives, rather than from any positive desire to remain together. Domestic violence was a reality in some peasant marriages, as in all social classes of medieval society. The combination of economic stress, limited resources, close living quarters in small cottages, cultural acceptance of husbands' authority over wives, and lack of effective intervention mechanisms created conditions where violence could occur and might go unaddressed. Community responses to domestic violence varied significantly. Some villages would intervene to protect abused spouses, with community elders confronting abusive partners, families taking in victims, or extreme cases leading to formal complaints to manor courts. Other communities maintained that household matters were private unless they became serious public scandals, leaving victims with little support. The relative lack of documentation for peasant romances means that understanding of peasant romantic life is more limited and fragmentary than knowledge of noble relationships. Peasants rarely wrote love letters that would be preserved in family archives for historians to study centuries later. Their marriages weren't recorded in elaborate contracts maintained carefully through generations. The details of their courtships and romantic feelings weren't documented in chronicles written by educated elites. What is known about peasant romantic life comes primarily from church records of marriages and baptisms, court cases when relationships went wrong and required legal intervention, occasional references in literature or chronicles written by social elites who often misunderstood or caricatured peasant behaviour, and careful interpretation of the limited evidence that does survive. What documentation exists suggests that peasant romantic life was more varied and complex than simple stereotypes would suggest. The historical record, limited though it is, contains evidence of peasants who married childhood sweethearts they'd loved for years, showing that long-term romantic attachments could develop and culminate in marriage. It includes peasant couples who entered practical partnerships arranged primarily by families with little romantic feeling between the partners initially. It documents passionate affairs that violated social norms, with peasants pursuing relationships despite community disapproval or practical obstacles. It shows peasants who lived in apparent contentment with matches that were arranged but proved compatible. The full range of human romantic experience appeared in peasant life, just as in any other social class, even if the specific forms and constraints differed. The shorter lifespans and higher mortality rates characteristic of medieval peasant life meant that many marriages ended with the death of one spouse while both were still relatively young. A peasant woman who married in her early 20s might be widowed by her 30s if her husband died in an accident or from illness. A peasant man might lose his wife to the dangers of childbirth or epidemic disease. Remarriage after such losses was common and often necessary for practical reasons. A widowed person with children and a farm to maintain needed a partner to manage the heavy labour that keeping the household functioning required. Second marriages for peasant widows and widowers were typically more pragmatic and arranged more quickly than first marriages. The emotional devastation of losing a spouse was real, but the practical necessity of remarrying meant that people couldn't indulge in extended mourning. A widower with young children might marry again within months, seeking a woman who could provide childcare and household labour. A widow might accept an offer from a man who could provide economic security and protection. These second marriages, born primarily from practical necessity, sometimes developed into caring partnerships, but began with fewer illusions about romance than first marriages might have carried. The inheritance patterns that governed peasant access to land significantly influenced marriage possibilities and timing in ways that varied across different regions of medieval Europe. In regions where partible inheritance divided family land among all children or all sons, younger sons might be able to establish independent households on their portions, and thus could marry relatively early once they received their inheritance. In regions where impartible inheritance passed land intact to a single heir, typically the eldest son, younger children often couldn't marry unless they could acquire land independently through rental arrangements, clearing new land, or marrying someone with land rights. These variations in inheritance customs created significantly different constraints on peasant romantic choice and marriage timing across different parts of medieval Europe. The seasonal rhythms of agricultural work influenced peasant courtship and marriage patterns in ways that were completely integrated into rural life. Courtship activities intensified during slower agricultural seasons in winter, when young people had more free time and energy for socializing. Marriages were often scheduled for fall after harvest, when food was abundant for wedding feasts, and the agricultural year was transitioning toward winter, when establishing and settling into a new household was more feasible than during busy planting or harvesting seasons. The integration of romantic life with agricultural cycles was complete and unquestioned, with peasants timing major life events around the natural rhythm of farming life that governed everything else in their world. The religious elements of peasant marriage were important, though perhaps less elaborated with ceremony than noble marriages. Peasants attended church regularly, confessed to priests, participated in sacraments, and understood marriage as a sacred bond blessed by the church. Their marriages had religious significance, and they took seriously the Christian teaching that marriage was permanent and indissoluble. This religious dimension provided both meaning and constraint, framing marriage as holy institution, while also imposing church rules about sexuality and partnership that peasants sometimes followed faithfully and sometimes violated when practical pressures or human desires overrode religious teachings. The community memory of peasant marriages contributed to local history and village identity in important ways. Village elders remembered and told stories about how particular couples met, marriages that overcame obstacles against the odds, tragic loves that circumstances prevented from being consummated in marriage, partnerships that endured through hardships and became examples of marital devotion. These stories, passed orally through generations since peasants rarely wrote down their histories, created communal knowledge about love and marriage that shaped younger generations' expectations and behaviours. While most of these stories have been lost, their influence on medieval peasant romantic life was substantial, providing models and warnings that guided how young people approached courtship and marriage. In the end, peasant romance was characterised by its integration into the practical necessities of agricultural life, its embeddedness in tight-knit village communities, and its relative flexibility compared to noble romance. Peasants couldn't afford the elaborate conventions of courtly love, nor did they face quite the same degree of rigid family control that structured noble marriages. They had to be practical in partner selection, but practicality didn't prevent emotional attachment or preclude genuine love. The peasant who married primarily for economic partnership might nonetheless develop deep affection for their spouse through shared labour and shared life. The practical and the romantic, rather than being opposed, could coexist and intertwine in peasant marriage in ways that transcended the sharp, noble distinction between arranged marriages and love matches. Peasant marriages occupied a middle ground where practical considerations and emotional attachments both played roles in creating partnerships that sustained medieval rural communities through generations. One of the most fraught and complicated aspects of medieval romance was love that crossed the rigid social boundaries that structured medieval society. Medieval Europe was intensely hierarchical, with clear divisions between nobility, clergy, merchants, artisans, and peasants, and elaborate gradations and distinctions within each broad category. Social position determined nearly every aspect of life, from legal rights to economic opportunities to where one could live and what one could wear. Romantic relationships were firmly expected to respect these hierarchical boundaries, with people courting and marrying within their social class and status level. When love violated these expectations, crossing lines of class status or legal condition, the consequences for those involved could be severe and sometimes tragic. The reasons for social endogamy, the practice of marrying within one social group, were both intensely practical and deeply ideological. Practically, marriages between social equals simplified property arrangements since wealth and land stayed within appropriate social levels. Such marriages maintained family status across generations, rather than diluting it through inappropriate matches. They avoided the complications of unequal partnerships where one spouse had superior social status and the resulting power imbalances and legal complications that created. And they preserved the networks of alliance and mutual support between families of similar status that were crucial for navigating medieval social and economic life. Ideologically, medieval society believed firmly in natural hierarchy, the idea that social positions were divinely ordained, and that maintaining these divisions was part of proper social and cosmic order. This belief held that God had placed people in different stations in life according to his purposes, and attempting to rise above one's station or marry inappropriately across class lines was thus not just socially disruptive, but actually contrary to divine will. Romantic love that ignored social boundaries threatened both the practical arrangements that kept society functioning and the ideological foundations that justified and explained the social order. For nobility, marrying beneath one's station was considered actively degrading, literally reducing one's social status and bringing shame upon one's family. A nobleman who married a peasant woman might lose his noble position entirely, be expelled from court circles, and face complete ostracism from his class. His children from such a union would have ambiguous status that could prevent them from inheriting titles or property that would normally pass to legitimate noble children. The social costs of cross-class marriage for nobility were high enough to deter most such relationships, and families intervened forcefully when inappropriate attachments did form, using every means at their disposal to prevent marriages that would damage family status. Royal and high noble marriages faced the strictest restrictions because political consequences were greatest. A royal marriage to someone of inappropriate status could destabilize royal succession if heirs of questionable status were born. It could create diplomatic incidents with foreign powers if a royal abandoned an arranged match for a love match with an inappropriate partner. It could damage royal prestige and authority if the monarch seemed unable to control personal desires and subordinate them to duties of state. Royal families therefore monitored their members' romantic entanglements with extreme care and intervened decisively and sometimes ruthlessly when inappropriate attachments formed. Many romantic tragedies in medieval history involved royals whose love for someone deemed unsuitable was forcibly ended, sometimes through forced separation, sometimes through forced marriage to the appropriate partner instead, and occasionally through more extreme measures that removed the inappropriate partner from contention permanently. For women, the consequences of cross-class romance were often dramatically more severe than for men, reflecting the intense concern with female sexual purity and the ways that women's romantic choices affected family honour. A noble woman who became romantically involved with a man of substantially lower status faced accusations of degrading not just herself, but her entire family bloodline. Her reputation could be utterly destroyed, her marriage prospects completely ruined if the inappropriate relationship became known, and her family might disown her entirely, rather than accept the shame she had brought upon them. Men faced significant consequences for inappropriate romantic choices as well, but they had somewhat more flexibility, and their transgressions were judged somewhat less harshly. This gender double standard reflected broader inequalities in how sexual and romantic behaviour was judged according to gender throughout medieval society. Yet despite all these obstacles and dangers, cross-class romances did occur with some regularity. The historical record contains numerous examples of people who fell in love across social boundaries and attempted to pursue these relationships despite the formidable obstacles they faced. Some succeeded through remarkable determination, fortunate circumstances, or unusual combinations of factors that allowed them to overcome social opposition. Others were forcibly separated, their love crushed under the weight of family and social disapproval, leaving them to carry lifelong grief for relationships that couldn't be consummated. Still others conducted long-term clandestine relationships that persisted for years or even decades, despite being unable to formalize their unions through marriage, meeting secretly and maintaining elaborate pretenses to avoid discovery. One significant context where cross-class romance could sometimes succeed, or at least become acceptable to families that might otherwise oppose it, was when economic need overrode status concerns. A noble family facing serious financial difficulties might accept a marriage between their daughter and a wealthy merchant, gaining desperately needed infusions of money in exchange for what they accepted as marginal loss of status. The merchant gained enhanced social prestige through connection to nobility, while the noble family gained financial resources to maintain their lifestyle and position. These arrangements were negotiated carefully with elaborate contracts that specified exactly what each party would gain, designed to minimize social damage while achieving crucial practical goals. The Church's official position on cross-class marriage was theoretically more flexible and egalitarian than secular society's rigid hierarchies. Canon law, the body of church law that governed marriage among other matters, held that legitimate marriage required only free consent of both parties and proper Christian blessing, without any requirement that the parties be of equal social status. A marriage between a peasant and a noble, while highly socially inappropriate and likely to generate enormous practical difficulties, was legally valid in the eyes of the Church if it was properly conducted with genuine consent and appropriate religious ceremony. This created interesting tensions where church authorities might be compelled to recognize marriages that secular society rejected as impossible or invalid. However, the Church rarely pushed this theoretical equality very hard against strong secular opposition to cross-class marriages. Church officials were themselves embedded in the social hierarchy, with most bishops, abbots, and other high church officials coming from noble families and naturally sharing many aristocratic prejudices and assumptions. While they might defend the theoretical right to cross-class marriage when pressed on points of canon law, in practice they usually discouraged relationships that would create serious social disruption or conflict with powerful noble families whose support the Church needed. The gap between the Church's theoretical position that any Christian could marry any other Christian and the practical reality that church officials usually supported social hierarchy was wide and rarely bridged. Certain cross-boundary relationships faced particularly severe and sometimes violent opposition. romantic relationships between Christians and Jews were absolutely forbidden, viewed as religious transgression that went far beyond mere social inappropriateness. Such relationships, if discovered, could result in severe punishment for both parties, with particularly harsh consequences typically falling on the Jewish partner, who might face violence, expulsion, or worse. Similar absolute prohibitions existed regarding relationships between Christians and Muslims in border regions where both populations lived in proximity. These religious boundaries were treated as even more fundamental and inviolable than social class boundaries. Relationships between free persons and serfs created legal complications in addition to social problems. In some regions, particularly in parts of France and Germany, legal codes specified that a free person who married a serf might become legally bound to the serf's lord themselves, losing their free status in the process. This legal consequence created powerful incentives against such relationships beyond the social stigma, with families intervening desperately to prevent children from making romantic choices that would reduce the family's legal status and rights. Even in regions without such automatic legal consequences, the social gulf between free and unfree status was enormous, and marriages across this divide were extremely rare and generally disastrous for both parties. The clergy represented another complicated social and legal boundary that romantic relationships sometimes crossed despite absolute prohibitions. Priests, monks, and nuns had all taken vows of celibacy that theoretically prohibited romantic relationships entirely. Yet clerical celibacy was imperfectly observed throughout the medieval period, with many clergy maintaining long-term relationships and raising families despite their vows. These relationships crossed the boundary between sacred and secular, between those consecrated to religious life and ordinary lay people, violating religious obligations while nonetheless satisfying very human needs for emotional connection and companionship that vows couldn't entirely suppress. Clergy who maintained romantic relationships faced consequences that varied enormously, depending on their rank, the rigour of enforcement in their region, and the political circumstances surrounding them. Some clergy openly acknowledged their partners and children, paying periodic fines to their bishops, but otherwise continuing their religious duties normally, in communities where enforcement of celibacy was lax, and the reality of clerical families was simply accepted even if not officially approved. Others maintained elaborate secrecy, hiding their relationships from church authorities, who would have penalised them severely if the relationships had been discovered. The enforcement of clerical celibacy varied so dramatically across time and place that generalisations are difficult, with some regions and periods seeing reasonably strict enforcement, while others saw clerical marriage or concubinage as normal despite theoretical prohibitions. For laypeople who became romantically involved with clergy, the consequences also varied but were generally negative. Women who had relationships with priests faced considerable social condemnation and might be labelled with derogatory terms that damaged their reputations, though they rarely faced formal legal punishment beyond social stigma. Men who conducted relationships with nuns faced both religious and legal consequences, since such relationships violated the nun's consecrated status. Nuns were considered married to Christ, and a man who engaged in a relationship with a nun was effectively committing adultery against Christ himself, a serious spiritual transgression. He was also essentially stealing church property, since the nun was part of her religious community, and corrupting her damaged the community's spiritual integrity. The power imbalances inherent in many cross-class relationships created dynamics that were often exploitative regardless of whether there was any genuine mutual affection. A nobleman pursuing a peasant woman held enormous power advantages, social, economic, and legal, that made truly free consent questionable, even if the woman claimed to reciprocate his feelings. Her subordinate position meant she couldn't easily refuse his advances without risking retaliation that might destroy her life. She might be evicted from land her family farmed, economically ruined, or socially destroyed if she rejected a powerful man's interest. Many cross-class relationships were essentially coercive, though some uncertain proportion may have involved genuine mutual affection, operating within deeply unequal power structures that complicated any assessment of whether consent was truly free. The literary tradition, particularly courtly love romances and popular tales, sometimes celebrated cross-class romance in highly stylized and ultimately safe ways. Stories of noblemen falling in love with virtuous shepherdesses featured prominently in Romance literature, as did tales of knights discovering that the apparent peasant girl they loved was actually noble-born but raised in obscurity. These stories acknowledged the romantic appeal of love that crossed class boundaries while usually resolving the status conflict through plot devices that made the match socially acceptable after all. The shepherdess would turn out to be a noble lady in disguise, or she would be revealed as actually noble by birth, or the knight would be elevated in status as reward for heroic deeds, allowing the romance to conclude with a marriage that didn't actually violate social hierarchies. The literature thus allowed audiences to fantasize about cross-class romance, while ultimately reinforcing the message that such relationships couldn't work in reality unless social status was equalized. Real cross-class couples who managed to maintain relationships despite social opposition developed various strategies for managing the practical difficulties and social disapproval they faced. Some relocated to distant areas where their backgrounds and social positions were unknown, essentially creating new identities where they could present themselves as social equals without the history that would make their unequal match obvious and problematic. They might move to cities where anonymity was possible, and where neighbours wouldn't know their family backgrounds and previous social positions. Others found occupations or circumstances where class distinctions mattered less than they did in traditional aristocratic or rural settings. Merchant communities in growing medieval cities had somewhat more fluid social structures than hereditary aristocracy, with wealth and commercial success sometimes mattering more than ancient bloodlines. A couple that would be impossible in an aristocratic court or rural village might find acceptance in a mercantile urban environment where old-class distinctions carried less weight. Still others conducted long-term clandestine relationships, meeting secretly while maintaining public lives that appeared entirely conventional and appropriate. These hidden relationships required elaborate deception and constant vigilance to avoid discovery that would destroy both parties. Yet some couples maintained such secret relationships for years, finding ways to be together despite being unable to publicly acknowledge their bonds or formalize their partnership through marriage. The emotional strain of such secrecy was enormous, but for those deeply attached to inappropriate partners, it seemed worth enduring rather than abandoning the relationship entirely. The children born of cross-class unions faced particular challenges, regardless of whether the relationship was formalized through marriage or remained informal. Their ambiguous social status created identity confusion and limited opportunities. In some contexts, they were scorned by both parent communities, seen as too elevated by the lower status community, but insufficiently legitimate for acceptance by the higher status group. In other contexts, wealthy fathers could secure reasonable social positions for children born to lower status mothers through careful financial provision, strategic placement in appropriate households or religious institutions, and ensuring the children received educations and skills that would allow them to make their own ways in the world. Geographic and social mobility sometimes enabled cross-class relationships that would have been impossible in more static circumstances. A couple whose relationship would be unthinkable in their home community might relocate to a growing city where anonymity and weaker social networks allowed them to establish themselves without constant scrutiny of their backgrounds. Medieval cities, with their more dynamic economies, emphasis on trade and craft over hereditary status, and larger populations that made anonymity possible, provided some refuge for couples crossing social boundaries. The economic changes of the later medieval period, particularly the growth of a prosperous merchant class whose wealth sometimes exceeded that of minor nobility, complicated traditional class boundaries and created new possibilities for cross-class marriage. Wealthy merchants desired the social prestige that connection to nobility would bring. Some noble families, particularly those facing financial difficulties, needed the substantial wealth that successful merchants commanded. Marriages between these groups became more common in the 14th and 15th centuries, though they still generated considerable controversy and required careful negotiation of the status implications and social management of what were still seen as fundamentally unequal matches. Some cross-class romances became legendary, passing into folklore and literature where they were remembered and retold for generations as either cautionary tales or romantic tragedies depending on the interpretation. These stories, whether based on actual historical events or entirely fictional creations, reflected deep cultural anxieties about social boundaries and the disruptive potential of romantic desire. They acknowledged that love could and did cross social lines while simultaneously reinforcing messages about the difficulties and usually tragic consequences of doing so, serving both to validate the intensity of human romantic feeling and to warn about the dangers of allowing that feeling to override proper social hierarchies. The persistence of cross-class romance, despite all the severe obstacles and terrible consequences, testified powerfully to the strength of human romantic attachment. People repeatedly chose to pursue relationships that violated fundamental social norms, accepting substantial risks to their economic security, social status, family relationships, and even sometimes physical safety, because their emotional bonds to inappropriate partners were strong enough to justify these enormous sacrifices. This human capacity to value personal emotional connection over social advantage and material security appeared throughout medieval society, creating countless individual dramas even if most were never recorded in surviving historical sources. For medieval society as a whole, cross-class romance represented a persistent threat to social order that had to be managed through elaborate systems of control. Legal restrictions, social pressure, family intervention, and continuous cultural messaging that reinforced appropriate social hierarchies and warned against crossing them. All these mechanisms were deployed to prevent or punish cross-class relationships. The very elaboration of these control systems demonstrated how seriously medieval society took this threat, and how much effort was required to maintain social boundaries against the constant pressure of human romantic attraction that repeatedly violated those boundaries despite all attempts to prevent it. Yet perfect enforcement was impossible, and cross-class romance never disappeared entirely. People continued falling in love across boundaries throughout the medieval period, creating situations that somehow had to be addressed or contained. The result was a complex landscape where some cross-class relationships were discovered and crushed ruthlessly. Others were tolerated with varying degrees of disapproval and social marginalization, and a small number managed to achieve some form of grudging social acceptance through unusual circumstances or extraordinary persistence. Each situation was negotiated individually, with outcomes depending on specific circumstances, the relative power positions of those involved, the determination of the couple to stay together despite opposition, and often simple luck regarding whether the relationship was discovered and how authorities and families chose to respond. As dawn breaks over this exploration of medieval romance, a comprehensive picture emerges of human resilience, creativity, and the persistent capacity for love even under challenging circumstances. Medieval people fell in love much as people in all times have fallen in love, experiencing the full range of romantic emotions from initial attraction through passionate devotion to heartbreak when love couldn't be fulfilled. What made medieval romance distinctive wasn't the emotional experiences themselves, but rather the elaborate social frameworks within which those emotions had to be expressed, and the substantial constraints that shaped how romantic feelings could be translated into actual partnerships. The arranged marriage system demonstrated medieval society's prioritization of practical, economic, and political considerations over individual romantic preferences. Yet within this system, real human relationships unfolded in all their complexity. Some arranged marriages became genuine love matches through years of shared experience. Others remained merely functional partnerships. Still others trapped people in misery. The full spectrum of human relationship experiences occurred within arranged marriage, making it impossible to characterize the system as simply good or bad, but rather as a framework that shaped but didn't entirely determine the quality of individual marriages. The courtly love tradition offered vocabulary and concepts for celebrating romantic devotion, even in a society that officially subordinated romance to practical concerns. Whether primarily literary fantasy or reflection of actual practices, courtly love influenced how educated people understood and expressed romantic feelings, providing models and language that enriched medieval romantic culture and left lasting impact on Western concepts of romance. Peasant romance, lived by the majority of medieval people, integrated romantic feelings with the practical realities of agricultural life in ways that created its own distinctive patterns. Less constrained than noble romance by elaborate family politics, but still operating within community oversight and economic necessities, peasant couples navigated between romantic desires and practical requirements in ways that produced the same full range of relationship outcomes seen in other social classes. cross-class romance demonstrated the power of human romantic attachment to persist, despite severe social obstacles. People risked everything to pursue inappropriate loves, testament to love's capacity to override even the most powerful social pressures and material considerations. While many such relationships ended tragically, their mere existence proved that romantic feeling couldn't be entirely controlled by social structures. Women's experiences of medieval romance were shaped by particular constraints that limited their choices and made their romantic lives more precarious than men's. Yet within these limitations, women found ways to express desires, influence outcomes, and sometimes achieve happiness. The persistence of female agency within patriarchal constraints enriched medieval romantic culture, even as it highlighted the injustices women faced. The material and linguistic expressions of medieval romance, from love tokens to poetry to elaborate courtship rituals, demonstrated sophisticated emotional literacy. Medieval people developed complex ways of communicating romantic feelings that worked within their cultural context, creating moments of genuine intimacy and connection despite social surveillance and constraint. The study of medieval romance ultimately reveals that romantic love is a human universal that appears in all societies even when social structures attempt to suppress or control it. Medieval frameworks for managing romantic relationships were different from modern ones, prioritizing different values and creating different constraints. But the underlying human capacity for romantic attachment transcended these frameworks, ensuring that people fell in love, pursued partnerships, and created intimate connections regardless of whether social structures approved or facilitated their desires. The legacy of medieval romance extends into the present in countless ways, from wedding traditions to romantic literature to ongoing negotiations between romantic desire and practical considerations. Understanding how medieval people navigated their romantic lives provides valuable historical perspective on the eternal human challenge of balancing personal desires with social expectations and creating meaningful partnerships despite whatever obstacles circumstances present. Medieval romance was neither perfect nor hopelessly oppressive, but rather deeply human, containing beautiful and tragic elements, shaped by context but expressing universal desires. The medieval lover, whether following prescribed paths or defying convention, engaged in the same fundamental human quest that continues today, seeking connection, affection, and partnership with another person despite uncertainty and risk, creating intimate bonds that provide meaning and sustenance through life's journey.